In 2001, Irish author Eoin Colfer released an urban fantasy crime adventure called Artemis Fowl. Artemis Fowl felt very unique for me reading it as a kid because it was the only story I had read where the main character was straight up a villain. 12-year-old Irish genius Artemis Fowl has people assaulted, he has property blown up, he kidnaps, he lies, and he manipulates the emotions of both his enemies and his allies in order to get all the right pieces into place for his criminal enterprises to succeed. And failing to commit to these attributes more than anything else is why the Artemis Fowl movie is the worst novel to film adaptation ever made, because it refuses to allow Artemis to be evil, thus robbing the story of all of its weight and tension. One of the marks of a truly great story is that it has a lot of confidence in its own premise, and if there's anyone who makes this look effortless, it's Eoin Colfer. More than simply making us believe in his characters, Colfer knows how to convincingly write and describe the imaginary science of how his world operates. In my Harry Potter video, I praised J.K. Rowling for her world building that convincingly makes you want to inhabit her wizarding world. But Eoin Colfer builds a fantasy world that you can almost believe actually exists, as he blurs the line between real-life science and bureaucracy and his fictional kind. As our book begins, Artemis Fowl, the latest in a long line of criminals, is attempting to restore the family fortune, which has been substantially reduced thanks to the bad business decisions of the MIA Artemis Fowl Sr. By combining his youth with his intelligence, Artemis is both open to the possibility of fairies and smart enough to follow the clues from folklore and myth in order to actually track one down. In Eoin Colfer's world, the fairies operate on a parallel but different religious and cosmological framework, where instead of the Bible and things like holy water, the fairies have the book and rituals which give them magical powers. By convincing a disgraced fairy to let Artemis copy their fairy Bible, Artemis becomes the first human to decode the fairy language, called Gnomish, allowing him to exploit the elaborate rules that govern fairy lives. As a fun Easter egg, all the versions of Artemis Fowl that I read featured a simplified version of Gnomish in the margins of the book, allowing you to imitate Artemis and decode secret messages that would give you more lore. Thanks to the book, Artemis learns that fairies need to replenish their magic whenever it runs out by burying an acorn plucked from an oak which is next to flowing water. With the help of his gigantic bodyguard known only as Butler, Artemis stakes out likely spots for fairy activity around Ireland until he gets lucky and is able to ambush Captain Holly Short. I said earlier that Eoin Colfer makes a very believable world, but he is also a father and he can't resist making dad jokes because the military force that Holly Short is a part of is called LEP Recon, or Leprechaun. Holly Short is very low on magic, but a fairy low on magic can still use their gift of tongues, the ability to speak all languages, and the mesmer, which is like fairy hypnosis. But thanks to the book, Artemis knows that the mesmer requires direct eye contact and doesn't work through mirrored lenses, so he and Butler brought sunglasses. With Holly captured, Artemis and Butler make their way back to Fowl Manor, the Middle Ages castle that all fowls inhabit. The book tells Artemis that once a fairy is inside his home, it has to follow direct commands from him, and that no fairy can enter a human home unless they are invited by a human occupant, much like with vampire mythology. Artemis also knows that a captain like Holly Short will have a sizable hostage fund, and so his very Irish plan is to separate the leprechauns from their gold to restore the Fowl family fortune. The fairies were all mostly driven underground centuries ago by human expansion, living instead in the lower elements, hence LEP Recon for Lower Elements Police. Julius Root, Holly Short's foul-tempered mentor and commander, is leading a siege assisted by the LEP's tech mastermind Foley, a centaur. For clarity, in this universe, the fairies or the people refer to anyone in the magical genus, so that includes centaurs, demons, dwarfs, elves, gnomes, goblins, pixies, and sprites. And there are a few other non-sentient nasties which exist, but apparently they don't count as fairies. The fairies have the power to erase memories and stop time, and their technology is far beyond humankind, which has allowed them to remain secret from humans and clean up any bad human encounters. The fairies think they hold all the cards, because even though they're not allowed to enter a human dwelling for now, they have every magical and technological advantage. But what they don't know is that Artemis has a copy of the book, and he knows every move they're going to make. First, they try sending in a reconnaissance team who are invisibly shielded, but Artemis reverse-engineered Holly's gear so Butler can see through shields. Then Commander Root tries negotiating, saying that once the time stop is over, the fairies will detonate a blue rinse biobomb if Artemis doesn't comply. But Artemis already knows all about the time stop and the bomb, and Artemis claims he can escape from it, which is supposed to be impossible. Next, Root tries sending in Mulch Diggums, a kleptomaniac tunneling dwarf. Mulch doesn't mind breaking the book because he's already lost his magic by repeatedly stealing from human dwellings over the centuries. He discovers that Artemis has a copy of the fairy Bible, but nearly gets nabbed by Butler. Meanwhile, Holly escapes from her cell with her magic restored thanks to an acorn she inadvertently smuggled from the oak tree, and she casts the mesmer on Butler's sister Juliet. While outside, Root gets temporarily ousted from his leadership position when he is betrayed by his friend Briar Cudgeon, who tries a more direct approach by simply sending in a troll to wreck Fowl Manor, the theory being that the troll will make one of the humans shout help, which can be interpreted as an invitation to come inside. Butler kicks the troll's butt using a medieval suit of armor, but begins to have misgivings about the kidnapping because Holly uses her magic to heal him. The LEP decide to just give Artemis Fowl the gold he wants at this point, because during the negotiations, Artemis said, "None of you has permission to enter here while I am alive," and they think that after he's dead from the biobomb, they will be able to enter and just grab the gold again. Artemis lets Holly go, but gives her half the gold back in exchange for healing his mother of her insanity from the loss of Artemis Fowl Sr., an important relationship that humanizes Artemis Jr. and helps us root for him during the novel. As promised, the fairies bomb Fowl Manor, but it turns out that Artemis wasn't bluffing about being able to escape, and by fairy law he now gets to keep the gold. Artemis escaped by figuring out that creatures who fall asleep can leave the time stop, but the time stop keeps you awake artificially. So to counteract this, Artemis and his allies drink sleeping pills which popped them out of the time stop. That doesn't make any sense to me, and I've read this book like 8 times, but it's a good book, so I'll forgive this nonsense. Holly Short vows revenge on Artemis Fowl, but the book says she has to steer clear for now. Next year, Artemis Fowl is pulled into a situation, rather than causing one, when he is brought in for questioning by the LEP because goblin gangs are making trouble, and they're doing it with fairy weaponry modified to accept human batteries. And Artemis is the only intelligent human who also knows about fairies. But when it becomes clear that Artemis is innocent, Root has the idea of using him and Butler to help them track down the vendor, since humans want to attract attention, which Holly is understandably unhappy about. In exchange for helping the LEP, Artemis negotiates fairy help in retrieving his father from Russian mobsters who are holding him for ransom. The gang head to Paris, where a Frenchman has been selling batteries to the goblins, but not entirely of his own free will, because disgraced LEP officer Briar Cudgeon has been secretly mesmerizing the French guy, as well as organizing the goblin revolt with his millionaire associate, the pixie Opal Cowboy. Cowboy recently upgraded the LEP with her own company's weaponry, and at her command all the guns stop working, which allows the goblins and their battery-powered weapons to start taking over the lower elements. Root and Holly have accompanied Artemis and Butler to Russia as promised, but once Cowboy gives the order, Root and Holly's guns stop working just in time for them to get ambushed by the goblins sent by Cudgeon. At the LEP, Opal Cowboy has hacked Foley's equipment and is planning to pin the rebellion on him, which allows herself and Cudgeon to be the heroes of the day once the goblins are dead. Foley is locked out of his own computer systems, but luckily Artemis left his laptop behind when the LEP grabbed him at the start of the book, and he's able to use Artemis's laptop to contact the team in Russia. The gang get the message and survive the goblins, and head back underground before rescuing Artemis Sr. Artemis suggests they break into Cowboy laboratories and reactivate the LEP weaponry, but in order to do that they recruit Mulch Diggums, who last year faked his own death and stole some of Holly's ransom money. With Mulch's help, they break into the facility, and on the journey, Artemis and Holly become begrudging acquaintances rather than mortal enemies. Foley, meanwhile, gets Cudgeon to confess to his master plan and records it on Artemis's laptop webcam. Artemis breaks into the Cowboy Lab's control center and broadcasts Foley's recording to the LEP. He briefly gets held as a hostage, but then it's revealed that Cudgeon also planned to betray Opal, and so they turn on each other. After the Goblin Rebellion is dealt with, it's back to Russia, where they successfully rescue Artemis Sr. The book ends with Holly giving Artemis a medal to remind him not to be a sucky person, a sentiment echoed by Artemis's father, who wants the whole family to go legit and stop doing crime. Many of the Artemis Fowl books often seem to go in cycles, where one book has a human threat, and then the next book has a fairy threat, and then repeat. In the Eternity Code, that threat is John Spyro, an American businessman to whom Artemis is advertising his new Sea Cube, a product Artemis invented based on reverse-engineered fairy technology. But Spyro just decides to steal the cube and kill Artemis. Artemis is fine, but Butler is mortally wounded and tells Artemis his real name before he dies, Domovoy. Desperate to save his friend, Artemis throws Butler in a freezer and sends out a string of fairy gibberish to get Foley's attention. Holly is dispatched and tries to heal Butler, but her magic isn't enough, and Butler ages multiple decades as a result, but he's alive. Artemis then tells Foley and Holly about the Sea Cube, which would hypothetically allow Spyro's research scientists to create technology that can discover the lower elements, which is pretty much Artemis's fault, so people are understandably unhappy with him. John Spyro realizes the cube is encrypted with an Eternity Code, and that means only Artemis can disable it, so he sends 2 thugs to Ireland to abduct Artemis. Lucky for Artemis, one of those thugs happens to be the irascible Mulch Diggums, who is pretending to be a human, and Mulch joins the team for another adventure. Commander Root makes a deal with Artemis, which is that he has to submit to a mind wipe of all his fairy memories after their heist to get the cube back, and in exchange he can have Holly's fairy help. Artemis agrees, but it's Artemis, so obviously he plans to escape the mind wipe. Artemis lets Spyro capture him so he can get inside Spyro's offices, where he uses a joke to convince Spyro to say the words, "You can bring all the fairy friends you want," which gives Holly permission to enter the building. With Holly's help, Artemis breaks into the vault with the C-Cube, and when Spyro catches him, Artemis leads him into a trap which allows the police to arrest Spyro. Back at Fowl Manor, to help sell the mind wipe, the fairies give Butler cosmetic surgery to make him look like the age he's supposed to be, though he still feels like a senior citizen. Artemis has instructed Butler to create fake ways of surviving the mind wipe for Fully Defined, but the real archive backup is hidden in the same coin Holly gave him, which he gives to Mulch. The fairies use the mesmer to make sure they've found everything they're supposed to, but Artemis and his friends cheat the system by wearing specially manufactured transparent mirrored contact lenses. Unfortunately for the world, after the mind wipe, the new Artemis Fowl is even more devoted to crime than the old one because he doesn't remember the positive fairy influences on his life. Hey, quick request. I've had a number of these stick figure videos do well over the last few years, but they take forever for YouTube to actually recommend to people. So if you haven't yet, please subscribe to my channel so more people can see my videos when they're actually released. Thanks. In the fourth book, Opal Cowboy escapes from prison by getting lackeys to replace her imprisoned self with a non-sentient illegal clone. Opal blows up Julius Root and frames Holly for it. Holly then goes AWOL so she can save Artemis. Artemis is in the middle of doing crime, of course, and in this case, acquiring a painting known as the Fairy Thief. But back at his hotel, Opal shoots a blue rinse biobomb into his room. Thanks to some quick thinking by Butler, they escape and Holly grabs Artemis and takes him to safety, though she can't take Butler too. Back in the lower elements, Foley is getting hampered by Internal Affairs Officer Ark Sewell, who is confident that Holly is just up and decided to be evil, and won't hear any other explanations. But on the plus side, nobody is trying to catch Holly because the biobomb shorted out her helmet, and they think she's dead. Meanwhile, Opal's plans go far beyond simple revenge, since she is attempting to betray all fairy kind by posing as a human girl using surgery, and mesmerizing her wealthy benefactor to play the role of her adoptive father, then using a drill to expose the lower elements. Opal tracks down Artemis and Holly, and does the supervillain thing of killing them slowly enough to be rescued by letting them die surrounded by trolls. Luckily, Butler's memories have returned thanks to a visit from Mulch Diggums, who has predictably escaped police custody again, and they stop by to help out. Thanks to the disc Artemis gives Mulch, everybody remembers what they're supposed to remember now, and the plan is to stop Opal from drilling into the lower elements, which they do, and Opal loses her magic as a consequence of her surgery to make her more human. The LEP imprisons Opal again and clears Holly, but Holly won't work for Ark Sewell, who has become the new commander of the LEP. So she quits and opens a private detective agency with Mulch, which is only possible because Artemis forged info saying that Mulch's previous arrests by the LEP were illegal. Artemis also feels a crisis over what to do next as he debates whether to be a thief. The Lost Colony is the next Artemis Fowl book, and for my money it's the one with the most interesting addition to the lore of this universe. In The Lost Colony, Eoin Colfer introduces us to the demons, which are the fairy race which noped out of town to their own private island dimension, outside of space and time, because they didn't want to move underground with the rest of the fairies. Demons in the Artemis Fowl novels are basically nothing like demons in any other context, as they're more like goblins for all intents and purposes. Demon warlocks are the most powerful magic users of the fairy world, but most demons aren't magical, and the warlocks are thought to all be dead. The demon dimension occasionally plucks its inhabitants out of time and deposits them at random intervals of human history, unless the demons anchor themselves to their current time and place using silver. Artemis begins this book by tracking down a demon in Barcelona, and accidentally gets sucked back through time with him, and slightly alters history by becoming included in a local building's artwork, before returning to the present thanks to the fact that Butler is wearing some silver. Meanwhile, in the lower elements, Mulch Diggums and Holly Short's detective career is abruptly cut short so we can reset the status quo, because they get recruited into a top-secret branch of the LEP called Section 8 that doesn't answer to Sewell. At this point in the novels, far from being enemies, Holly and Artemis are good friends, and Holly makes what I can only assume are illegal phone calls to ask him for advice from time to time. Book 5 is one of my favorites, and I'm really struggling not to be overly descriptive here so I can keep this video short. In addition to Holly and Artemis, in this novel we get a third protagonist in the form of a demon known as Number 1. Number 1 is one of the only magical demons in this dimension, meaning he doesn't get buffed like other demons when he hits puberty, but instead gets fantastic warlock powers. But he doesn't know that, and is instead bullied for being a late bloomer. There's one other magical demon in this dimension, which is Abbott, who is bewitching his people with the mesmer, but nobody suspects anything because non-warlock demons aren't supposed to have magic. Artemis, meanwhile, is checking out another demon appearance in Spain when Holly catches up with him. Artemis is actually trying to help the LEP this time around, because he's noticed the time spell is decaying, and more demons are appearing. But he and the LEP aren't the only ones tracking demons, it turns out, and we're shortly introduced to Minerva Paradiso, Artemis's female French equivalent who is trying to reveal the existence of demons to the world to get a Nobel Prize. Minerva captures Number 1, who has been teleported off his island intentionally by Abbott, who knows perfectly well that Number 1 is magical and sees him as a threat to his rule. Back at Minerva's own mansion, we get the Fowl Siege Part 2, but this time Artemis is on the fairy's side helping plan the extraction of Number 1. The extraction goes off relatively smoothly, but Minerva's dad employed a crazy person named Kong who thinks demons killed his brother, so Number 1 agrees to be traded back to Kong to ensure Minerva's safety, but they arrange an escape involving quickly removing silver and then reapplying it to Number 1. They also discover that the original warlocks who separated the demon island from time and space weren't disintegrated, but were turned to stone to protect them from the blast. Unfortunately, most of them are dead, but Number 1 is able to revive one of them called Quan. But Kong has activated a bomb, and Artemis tells Butler and Minerva to stay behind while he goes with Holly, Quan, and Number 1 to disarm it. But what Artemis actually does is remove the silver from Number 1 so that everyone is teleported to the demon dimension, so the bomb doesn't explode and kill random civilians. During the journey through time, Artemis's inquisitive mind siphons a bit of magic from Quan, and he becomes a magical creature himself. On the demon island, Artemis and Quan come up with a way of using the bomb as an energy source to bring all the demons out of the disintegrating time spell and attempt to pop them back on Earth. Quan says he needs a minimum of 5 warlocks to make the spell work. After realizing that one of the old warlocks got fused with Abbott, which is why he has magic, and after finding out that Artemis stole some magic for himself, they have just enough people to make the spell work. As time disintegrates on the island, paradoxes start happening, and at one point a demon shoots and kills Holly, but Artemis does sci-fi shenanigans and shoots a demon in the past to save Holly in the relative present. Artemis's job as an impromptu warlock is to focus on when they want to return to, and he does a pretty good job, at least from a fairy point of view. Artemis drops everyone out of the demon dimension 3 years after he left, leaving him with a lot of explaining to do to his parents, who have had 2 more sons since he was gone. Luckily, now that Artemis has magic, he simply mesmerizes them to forget about the whole ordeal. The next book is The Time Paradox, in which Artemis deals with the fallout of retaining magic. This includes a subliminal extension of the fairy rulebook, including nausea when entering a dwelling uninvited, and headaches during a full moon. Artemis's mother has also fallen ill, and he tries to use magic to heal her but can't, so he calls on Holly for help. But Holly reveals that the disease is spellotropy, which is impervious to magic and even spreads through the use of magic. Worse still, Artemis himself once killed the last of the lemurs needed to synthesize a cure in exchange for the money to fund the search for his father. Artemis then does one of the worst things he does in these books, which is convince Holly that she gave Artemis's mother the disease, even though Artemis knows it was probably him when he used the mesmer on her after book 5. This manipulation helps Artemis convince Holly and Foley to let Artemis travel in time and rescue the lemurs so they can synthesize a cure. In The Time Paradox, Eoin Colfer leans into the chemistry that is developed between Holly and Artemis and puts interspecies romance on the table by having Holly and Artemis in awkward situations and letting them share a kiss. Unfortunately, because of the bald-faced lie that Artemis told Holly, their relationship gets ruined before it even begins. But Artemis is able to save their friendship by getting Holly the chance to talk to Commander Root one last time. Predictably, the plans go awry in the past, and Artemis ends up interacting with his younger self and a younger butler, who act as antagonists in this story, since young Artemis's worldview is radically different from present-day Artemis. As the timeline unravels, Holly gets given to the people who were supposed to get the lemur. Artemis rescues Holly, but they run afoul of Opal Cowboy, whose younger self ends up following them back to the future, and arriving earlier than Artemis and Holly, putting into action the start of the book because the young Opal Cowboy was mind-controlling Artemis's totally healthy mother. But with the help of a young Artemis who is also there, they defeat young Opal, who becomes number 1 and number 2 on the LEP's most wanted list, and Artemis is forced to reveal the whole fairy world to his mother, since Opal's influence broke the mesmer. I really do not like The Time Paradox because it has the prequelitis problem where it makes characters do and say things that are inconsistent with how information is presented in earlier books, and I don't like that Colfer makes the Artemis and Holly ship canon only to immediately scuttle it for the rest of the series. I also don't like that the book makes young Artemis's interest in fairies something that was always fated to happen, because of residual memories from this adventure. My favorite lore addition that the next book gives is that it suggests that Artemis's interest in fairies came from a bedtime story his father read about a guy ripping off some leprechauns for their gold. This is a lot more meaningful than time travel shenanigans. The Atlantis complex is the penultimate Artemis Fowl novel, and it follows Artemis as he develops the titular OCD-like mental disease known as the Atlantis complex, which afflicts magical beings consumed by guilt. Artemis becomes destructively obsessed with numbers and fixates on 4 as unlucky, while 5 is lucky, going so far as to arrange his steps and sentences and plans into multiples of 5. While showing Foley, Holly, and LEP Commander Vinyaya an environmentalist project, Artemis's symptoms are so apparent that his friends immediately diagnose what's wrong. But before they can help, they are ambushed by murder bots sent by Turnbull Root, Julius Root's evil brother. Turnbull is an expert at magical runes that let him control people, and he is in love with a human woman who he magicked into loving him. By putting a rune on number 1, Turnbull hopes to keep his human wife young like fairies are. Turnbull himself has forfeited his magic by breaking fairy law, but thanks to a diet recommended by that one fairy from the first book, he is able to give himself back a small spark of magic that allows him to break out of prison and do dastardly deeds. Artemis, meanwhile, is spiraling even worse, and has developed a split personality that dubs itself Orion, and Orion happily expresses his admiration and love of Holly in front of Foley, much to Holly's consternation. For narrative convenience, whenever Artemis gets hit with an electric shock, he switches personalities, so the book has him flip-flopping throughout. So when Turnbull captures everyone, Artemis goads a lackey into shocking him because the Orion personality is unaffected by Turnbull's magic. Defeating Turnbull, Artemis is taken to a fairy psychiatric clinic for treatment, and the fairies let Butler, Juliet, who has finally had her memories restored, and Mrs. Fowl down to the lower elements. The fairies don't seem to have much OPSEC anymore when it comes to the Fowl family, and they no longer keep suggesting to mind-wipe everybody. The final mainline Artemis Fowl novel is The Last Guardian, which exhaustingly brings back Opal Cowboy once again. Cowboy was not the best villain of the series, and I think constantly bringing her back was a mistake. The Last Guardian fiddles with the lore again by suggesting that the real reason Artemis was interested in fairies was that ancient ghost fairy warriors who have been haunting Fowl Manor were influencing Artemis and the Fowl family into being interested in the supernatural, which is just kind of dumb, and once again tries to rob Artemis of his agency as a character. As the book starts, a newly cured Artemis is immediately plopped into a crisis when the old cowboy decides to kill her younger self, causing her to gain fabulous magical powers and create a ripple effect, destroying any cowboy technology created in the last 5 years. Cowboy kills her younger self at Fowl Manor, and then assumes command of the fairy ghost warriors who are vowed to kill humans, and some of the ghosts possess Artemis's siblings and Juliet. Opal is trying to activate ancient fairy magic that will kill all humans, and has already destroyed all global human technology. The magic is tied to her DNA, but lucky for Artemis, Opal created a clone of herself to escape back in Book 4, so Artemis gets the infantile clone to mess things up, and one of the ghosts turns on Cowboy, killing her. Artemis sacrifices himself to ensure Opal's downfall, completing his arc as a hero and dispelling all fairy ghosts. But Artemis always has a backup plan, and he convinced Foley to do something very illegal, and clone him from the saliva of a kiss he gave Holly before dying. Foley brings the clone to Fowl Manor, and Artemis possesses the brain-dead clone, effectively resurrecting himself. To clear up some ethical issues, Eoin Colfer has a line that establishes that clones don't have souls, so Artemis isn't technically supplanting another version of himself, but we're in very dodgy ethical territory. Overall, I love the Artemis Fowl series, but I do think it probably goes on for too long. The real heart of the series is Artemis's arc from villain to hero, and the length of the series forces Colfer to come up with reasons to reset Artemis's development, like the mind-wiping or the Atlantis complex, instead of just letting Artemis grow organically. But it's a really engaging and unique world, so being made to spend extra time in it isn't the worst thing. Thanks for watching.